Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 581, Queen of the Seas and King of the Earth. The arrival of the mermaid princess shocked everyone to the marrow of their bones, and even the top-ranking soul evolvers who had been informed about the fact that Xietain seemed to have formed some sort of alliance with an important existence of marine life expected that such existence to be a legendary mermaid. Therefore, everyone was dumbfounded. Xietain not only had smooth and shiny skin but her seductive body accompanied by her face whose beauty did not lose to Wu Yijuan level beauties made her a very gorgeous beauty. Even those small scales that were occasionally visible on her skin only added layers of mysterious and exotic, but not at all unpleasant charm. Therefore, coupled with the mysticism of mermaids, it was no wonder that her appearance stunned everyone. Human leader, I see that your people are really big. Xietain still kept some distance from the edge of the bridge, so when she reached 300 meters she stopped and carefully observed the large number of humans forming metal ranks reaching as far as the eye could not reach. Although the 300-meter distance between her and Xietain could be closed with a strong stomp from him and she knew it, Xietain was a creature of the seas and being too close to land would only weaken her power tremendously. Not to mention that she was still a little afraid of the power that Xietain had exhibited during the War of the Four Races on the bridge back then. Of course, Xietain understood the reasons of the mermaid princess and in fact, if he was in her position he probably wouldn't even get as close as she was doing now. After all, in this world, one could not even trust one's own race, so it was normal to think that trusting other races was even crazier. However, sometimes those we didn't know the most were often more trustworthy than those we did. You just had to find out. Shit. Nangongyi shouted again with wide eyes and said in shock, she can even speak Mandarin. Bang! Without warning, Nangongyi received a heavy blow on the head that sent him staggering several steps forward and, when he looked back he saw Zhongde staring at him. Surnamed Nangong, can you calm down? You are putting all of mankind to shame. Nangong Lingxin sighed and covered her face as if she was embarrassed as she muttered, even Xiaoming doesn't behave like this. Big brother, you really. In the distance, Xietain observed the weird human interaction with a raised eyebrow and couldn't help but remark, you humans sure are funny, aren't you? The corner of Xietan's mouth contracted several times as the urge of wanting to turn around to give Nangong a good beating was born and growing inside him, barely restraining himself against it reluctantly. Shangguan Bing Shui was not much different in this regard as she was the one in charge of warning everyone what was going to happen. If she had known that the key factor lay in the word mermaid she would have added it to the information. Anyway, mermaid princess. I see your army has grown a lot over the course of a week. Xietain wisely avoided the embarrassing matter from before and instead looked carefully at the several thousand sea beasts within the waters, stopping mainly at the three most conspicuous ones. Apart from the giant jellyfish, there was also a turtle over 20 meters tall whose shell was as big as the dome that covered the largest space telescope in China, and the tough scales covering its body looked tough enough to ignore any kind of piercing bullet with ease. This kind of defense-type creature would be a big problem to deal with as even the power of war tanks would be ineffective against it. Finally, there was also a swordfish at least 15 meters long and 4 or 5 meters tall that seemed to have some skill in controlling flames, as even while inside the water it managed to keep the fire surrounding its main weapon from causing problems when it touched the sea. A type attack creature at its maximum. All three were powerful second-order creatures, and if one added the shark from before to the three of them it could easily be deduced that Xietain currently had 4 second-order existences under her command. No, there was also Xiao Xiao, so she had 5 of them. This was a colossal contrast compared to the pitiful mermaid princess who had lost practically 90% of her army during the war against the Zombie Beast Alliance. But the most amazing thing of all was that she had managed to get such powerful subordinates in such a short time. This fact was very eye-opening and it greatly alerted Shangguan Bing Shui and Xietain as in a certain sense. These beasts were proof and representation of how dangerous the seas were. Xietain responded with a cheerful smile to the words Xietain said as the excitement was noticeable in her voice. "Oh, you mean these?" It was not difficult to recruit new troops. As I previously mentioned to you and Shangguan Bing Shui, the situation in the seas is too complicated right now, which is why food rules to some extent. I am not the only one who does not wish to see my breed devouring each other, therefore, after a bit of searching I managed to recruit over 10,000 new troops, among which are these 3 second-order existences. Xietain had invested practically 60% of all the zombie corpses, and about 40% of soul stones she obtained as spoils of war back then, all for the sake of recruiting these sea troops. The biggest investment was naturally made to gain the loyalty of the giant jellyfish, the defensive turtle, and the fire attack swordfish, but the 7th princess had realized one thing in the war over the bridge. At that time, even though the humans were only 2, they were so powerful that they alone could represent an entire race to form an alliance. Therefore, numbers did not always mean everything, despite their clear importance. Precisely for this reason, the approach of the 7th princess of the East Sea, whom everyone called stupid for dreaming about an impossible, changed slightly. "I see." Xietain nodded as his gaze inspected with apparent laziness over the soldiers of the 7th princess of the East Sea. Then, he turned to look at her and said with a smile, "You really are trustworthy, unlike many humans. You said you would come and here you are." Xietain adjusted a strand of hair behind her ear as she said slowly, "Xietain, remember that even though we can communicate and chat with each other, this is all thanks to the treasure embedded in my forehead. At the end of the day, you and I are living beings, belonging to completely opposite races. While you live on Earth, I live in the depths of the waters. Therefore, it is only natural that our train of thought differs. For humans, failing to keep their promises or reneging on their words was the most normal thing in the world. From minor matters to matters of life and death, there was no shortage of humans who could not be trusted at all, as their words were as insignificant as anything else that existed in the world. However, to the intelligent creatures of the sea, the word of a warrior represented everything. From the honor to the trust a warrior would have for the rest of their lives. Everything depended not only on the strength, but also on the courage a warrior gave themselves through the fulfillment of their promises. This applied especially for members of the royalty, and while Xietain was aware that she did not need to keep her word to a human, she had her principles just in the same way that Xietain had his. "I guess you're right," he said with a slight nod. Xiao, come with me." Xietain stretched both arms forward with a warm smile. However, little Xiao did not fly out to her right away as she normally would. The little pink dolphin looked at Xietain with teary eyes and seemed quite reluctant, something that made the heart of the human many people called cruel and selfish feel a bit bitter. "Pooh." Xiao made a low sound as if to express her pain, but finally obeyed the mermaid princess, and with a mighty jump using the body of Xietain as momentum she soared into the sky. "You, child." Xietain caught the little pink dolphin and didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she looked at Xietain and said, "Looks like Xiao really likes you." The little pink dolphin looked down at the bridge with teary eyes, and from the way her little body was trembling, it seemed like she was trying hard not to cry. Xietain held up both hands and decided not to comment on the matter. Instead, he decided to start with the matter that was really his business, since this could also help the little Xiao dolphin's sadness and pain to be relieved. "Xietain, you said before that you were not interested in the throne that would make you queen of the entire East Sea, didn't you?" Subconsciously, the body of Shangguan Bing Shui tensed slightly when she heard Xietan's question. They had been conversing throughout the travel here, so she was clear about what he intended to do next, and a lot of things were dependent on it. In fact, to say that the future of what would happen on land and in the depths of the seas was tied strongly to the conversation that was about to take place with a human and a mermaid as the main focus was not exaggerated at all. Xietain was about to urge Xietain to instruct his people to start crossing the bridge in order to get this all over with at once, since she was currently very busy, but his sudden and unusual question left her confused, so she couldn't answer right away. After several seconds, the mermaid princess blinked and nodded, still feeling confused. Yeah, actually, I have no interest in fighting for the throne. As I told you the other day, my goal is another one. If I'm not mistaken, your goal is to prevent within the margin of possibility your people from devouring each other, isn't it? Xietain asked, to which Xietain nodded. Then, he continued, correct me if I'm wrong, but what would happen if someone from your realm starts devouring creatures from other realms? Wouldn't that be a war, that is? Xietain frowned tightly. The question asked by Xietain had hit a really hard spot in the heart of the seventh princess. This question might seem insignificant, but it was actually very crucial, and that same question had been asked far before by her father. If you want to prevent your people from devouring each other, then you will have to attack other races. There is no other option. This, however, will lead to a war between races. So it doesn't matter if it is a war between sea kingdoms or not, since a war is a war and death is bound to happen. Xietain remarked in a serious voice, his eyes focused on the expression of the mermaid princess to observe her changes at all times. At the end of the day, the dream of Xietain was nothing more than that, a dream. While dreams could come true, usually dreams simply stayed as dreams. Not for nothing were there the phrases daydreaming or stop dreaming in the real world. What do you want to achieve by asking all this? Xietain looked at Xietain a little grumpily. Although she knew that the human in front of her was right, her heart and principles were not so weak as to give up her ideal just because of mere words. She would fight to the death to achieve her goal even if she failed in the attempt. Hearing the seventh princess's question, a faint smile grew at the corner of Xietain's lips. Now, each piece had fallen where he wanted it to be. The execution would be what would decide everything now. Xietain, how about forming an alliance with me? I'm not talking about a temporal alliance like the one we are currently in. I mean a total alliance where you will support me completely and I will support you with all my power. Xietain looked severely at the mermaid princess and proposed, not with the human race you can't trust, but with me, the one who will lead them. While Xietain was human, Xietain had already witnessed that at least for the most part she could trust him. While she still had certain reservations against him, this was because Xietain was just too strong, so it was natural to be somewhat fearful of someone like that. However, the seventh princess of the East Sea and the king of Xietain had worked together before. During that brief but important collaboration, the king of Xietain could have hidden the beast leader's corpse, and the seventh princess of the East Sea would never have known about it due to the existence of a legend-grade treasure such as the spatial storage ring. But he did not, and instead not only kept his word to surrender thousands of beast corpses and over 20 million zombies, but also gave Xietain a head which contained a priceless third-order soul stone inside. Xietain was silent for a long time before raising her head to look at Xietain. I'm hearing you. Xietain did not say yes, nor did she say no. However, the smile on Xietan's face finally settled completely as he realized that the deal was sealed in stone now. That's good. End of Volume 3. Volume name, Sea and Land Alliance. This volume was over 250 chapters long, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you later in the first chapter of Volume 4, Smiley Face. Remember to visit my other story, Samsara Online, if you like my writing style. 3. Many more interesting and exciting things to come. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 582, Chongping District First Growth of Earth's Mass, Part 1. Chapter 582, Chongping District First Growth of Earth's Mass, Part 1. As I said before, war is inevitable. If for the sake of feeding your people you attack another sea kingdom, not only will you be the trigger for the death of even more of your people, but your own father and family will surely not let you go easily. On the other hand, the power of your sea lives fall greatly when you step on land, so, no matter how powerful you are, you will definitely experience many casualties. The words that Xietain said once again hit critical points that made the mermaid princess's heart clench tightly. She, despite being taken for a fool, had naturally thought about the points Xietain had just made and therefore knew that as cruel as the reality. Maybe that was the truth she had to live in and therefore accept. Attack other sea kingdoms? Surely Xietain would obtain many corpses of other creatures to feed her people. But in return, she would unleash a war that would kill millions. Attack zombies or humans on land? Xietain would surely get some bodies to feed her people. But with the drastic decline in power of the sea creatures as they left the waters, the casualties her people would suffer would be catastrophic. Hadn't she experienced it a week ago in the War of the Four Races on the bridge? In fact, there were even many sea creatures that did not have the ability to leave the seas. Therefore, her hands were tied in this situation. After all, just like Xietain, the seventh princess of the Eastern Sea was not a supreme existence at all as to do as she pleased. Do you have something in mind? Xietain looked at Xietain with narrowed eyes. She didn't believe that someone like Xietain could have become so strong just coincidentally. To be strong, an existence also needed intelligence or tremendously powerful instinct to take them to the top. Of course, I do. Xietain smiled faintly and his eyes flashed curiously as he slowly said, you, as the seventh princess of the East Sea, cannot attack other sea realms to avoid a war. But I am different. After all, I am human. Xietain wanted to say something, but Xietain raised a hand to indicate her to be silent for a moment. Then, he continued, besides, just like in the seas, on land there are many races other than my human race. But in contrast to your sea lives, land creatures like us do not form firm kingdoms yet, so we are all fighting fierce wars constantly. Xietan's eyes flashed with a touch of coldness as he said, then, if you help me, you will be able to obtain hundreds of thousands and even millions of corpses of all kinds of species to feed your people. The eyes of Xietain shined brightly as if a million stars that had been sleeping inside awakened at the same time when Xietan's words clicked in her brain. Just as Xietain had just said, everything that was trouble to Xietain was nothing to him. What to her meant war to him was just a natural act to do. However, even though everything seemed perfect, the mermaid princess was no simpleton. She noticed several weak points in the statements of Xietain, so she didn't hesitate to point them out next. So, you're telling me that if we team up, we'll both get what we want without harming the other? Xietain asked with a frown. Seeing Xietain nod, she asked in confusion, but I don't understand, why would you choose me? In the seas, the intelligence of many creatures was no different from the intelligence of a human being, especially royalty members like Xietain. Therefore, if Xietain wanted to form an alliance, with his power he could easily seek his ways to contact some other prince or princess who was in a better position than her, and surely none would refuse. After all, who would turn down such a powerful ally when the battle for the throne of Lost City was becoming increasingly dangerous and heated? Even if Xietain was a being of the earth, there were many treasures in the seas capable of helping him close that gap for a certain period of time, more than enough time for him to cause chaos among the other sides with his monstrous strength. Naturally, I have my reasons. Xietain raised a hand with his clenched fist and extended a finger upward. First of all, you are trustworthy. You have proven yourself before, and I am sure that considering your pride and kindness to your people you will not break your own principles. While it is true that the other princesses or the other princes of the East Sea might be as trustworthy as you, I have no time to waste looking for them, and I don't want to risk meeting a treacherous dog either. Although Xietain did not understand the slang treacherous dog very well, she understood 99.9% of what Xietain wanted to explain with his words. Moreover, it was clear from how he openly narrated about his urgency that he was being sincere about this. Second point. Xietain extended another finger upwards and continued calmly. Unlike the other princes and princesses who were willing to kill themselves just for the sake of sitting on some golden or diamond throne, you, Xietain, you scramble your head thinking of ways to help your people without harming your family, even though they would not hesitate to kill you for a single second if it is for their benefit. I think this is another proof of your dignity and pride, therefore, one more point to trust you for. Xietain Mayer looked at Bai Zemin with weird eyes and could not help but remark, even though they are my siblings, we only share blood on our Lord Father's side. In fact, considering that my mother is only a low-ranking mermaid, it is already a miracle that I am considered part of the royal family. However, Bai Zemin shook his head and said in a firm voice, family is family. There is no need for us to debate this point here, Princess. You and I were raised differently and thus our views towards our family probably differ greatly as well. Therefore, it is better not to waste time on this matter. Although Xietain Mayer was still confused, since to her the other princes and princesses were not family at all, she nodded without saying anything else. After all, as Bai Zemin had just pointed out, the two of them had lived 1000% opposite lives until now. Moreover, she was also surprised at how heavy his voice was, as this was probably the first time she had heard the human in front of her be so unwavering about something. But in fact, from the point of view of Bai Zemin, the words of Xietain Mayer were no different from pure nonsense. He had lived his whole life with a girl he didn't even share half a drop of blood with. They were raised together as siblings and were close as if they really were. Just because he didn't share any DNA with her, Bai Zemin shouldn't consider Meng-Chi as his sister? Pure bullshit. To him, the family was the family and the family should be there to help and support each other, not to kill each other for some gold coins. Simple as that. Putting aside the mermaid princess's question, Bai Zemin raised a third finger and said in a serious voice, third and final point. Our goals somehow align with each other in such a way that we will do little or no harm to each other's interests. Xietain Mayer lowered her head to think for a moment before raising it again and asking, you still haven't told me what you want. She frowned and pursued, Bai Zemin, what is your goal and what do you have in mind to achieve it? I cannot give you an answer until I know this. Bai Zemin lowered his hand again and said without missing a beat, my goal is simple. First of all, I want to rule China and I must achieve it before 11 months pass from this point. I see. Xietain Mayer was not too surprised by the goal of wanting to rule China. What surprised her was the clearly tight time limit. However, she didn't know much about surface affairs, so she didn't get too much into it either. In exchange for your help in making me the king of China, I will help you become queen of the East Sea, he said, taking the mermaid princess by surprise. Queen of the East Sea? The lost queen? Xietain Mayer raised her voice and practically shrieked as if she had become hysterical. Are you crazy? To do that I would need a huge army. Not only that, I will also have to fight all the princes and princesses of the East Sea, but even then I will have to face Lord Father at the end to prove that I am worthy of the throne. Although Xietain Mayer understood the reason why Bai Zemin proposed such a thing, she could not help but look at him as if he was a lunatic. After all, she knew how powerful the other factions of her realm were, and in her eyes, wanting to become the queen to gain total control over her realm in order to avoid continuous mass murder was nothing more than an impossible fantasy to achieve. The voice of Xietain Mayer was very loud, so those who were in the first few hundred meters near the bridge could hear her clearly. However, none of them understood much of what the conversation was about. Still, the words army and fighting, as well as princes and princesses, were enough for even the dumbest of them to realize that something really big was being planned ahead. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Bai Zemin with a serious expression, wanting to see what kind of answer he would give next. Bai Zemin's reply was very simple. His expression was as indifferent as his voice as he said, and. Xietain Mayer looked at him with wide eyes as she muttered under her breath. She expected any reply but one as simple and plain as that one, so she didn't know how to react or what to say next. But in fact, Shangguan Bingshui chuckled and shook her head as she closed her eyes. Even though she was somehow expecting it, Bai Zemin's response was even funnier than she thought it would be. As expected of him, I guess. She muttered quietly enough such that only she could hear her. Bai Zemin looked at the seventh princess and said indifferently, no matter how many princes or princesses there are and no matter how many troops they have, in the face of absolute power they will all become paper castles. Xietain Mayor, have you forgotten what happened in the war a week ago? Let me tell you that before you arrived, I was single-handedly fighting against the Zombie Beast Alliance. On my own, I managed to obliterate over 10 million enemies even though my soul was wounded due to carelessness. On my part, you were fighting alone against all of them. The pupils of Xietain Mayor trembled when she heard Baizemen's words, and indeed she did not doubt him because a person whose pride came from the bones would never use such low lies to make himself noticed, and she could feel that the human in front of her was tremendously proud. Baizemen ignored the question of Xietain Mayor, which was mostly directed at herself as if she wanted to assure something, and instead continued, in my eyes, armies mean nothing. As long as a fourth-order existence does not appear, even a high-level third-order existence is not worthy of making me fear at present. Although Xietain Mayor could sense the confidence in Baizemen's voice and associating this to what she had seen with her own eyes days ago, she knew he had his reasons to be so confident. She still sighed and shook her head. Baizemen, I don't know too much about the surface, but likewise you don't know how terrifying the seas are, either. My total army currently stands at around 30,000 warriors, among which there are 1,000 first-order and 4 second-order existences if we don't include Xiao Xiao. However, compared to the troops in the hands of the other princesses and princes, I am no more than an insignificant pawn. It is also because of this that I have so far been ignored. While it was true that in the face of absolute power the armies would collapse sooner or later, the problem was that Xietain Mayor could sense that Baizemen was still a first-order existence. Sure, he was strong and she did not doubt it, however, could he fight against thousands of second-order creatures? Could he really take on dozens of third-order? Xietain Mayor wouldn't believe it even if she was beaten to death on the spot. Baizemen realized that they would get nowhere at this rate, therefore, he proposed another idea, one which would serve to fulfill his own goal, buy him time, avoid trouble, and also for Xietain Mayor to understand more about how strong he was and how much stronger he could be in the future. Then, how about this? Baizemen looked at the mermaid princess and proposed, you and I will enter into an alliance in which you will help me conquer the entire periphery of China when I request it. In return, I will give you 100% of zombie corpses, 20% of beast corpses, and also 40% of soul stones obtained during those joint attacks. What do you say? Lilith, who was invisible to the eye, felt Baizemen suffer when he said those words, but she chuckled and whispered in his ear, little brother, don't worry, believe me when I tell you that you will get something really good when you help this little mermaid get the throne. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 583, Chongping District First Growth of Earth's Mass, Part February 2nd. Chapter 583, Chongping District First Growth of Earth's Mass, Part February 2nd. Before Baizemen arrived at the bridge, Lilith had talked to him and she had recommended that he should form an alliance as strong as possible with the mermaid princess now that he and she had some kind of relationship. In fact, it was during the previous night when Lilith had disappeared after he had told her in more detail about the war on the bridge that took place a week ago, and when she came back that she started to insist on it constantly. Although Lilith gave no reasons and simply smiled every time he asked her about it, Baizemen was no fool and knew that since she was so insistent on the matter there should be something really good in the seas that in the future would be of use to him. In any case, it wasn't as if Baizemen hadn't thought about it since he was planning to form an alliance with the 7th princess of the East Sea anyway. However, he definitely wouldn't have offered so much just for some manpower. Zombie corpses were a thing, but the bodies of mutant beasts were of great use to humans. There was basically no part of them that could be considered total trash. As for the 40% of soul stones, this might seem like a small percentage when you compared it to the 60% that Baizemen would keep, but, considering the amount of beings that walk the earth, that number would definitely not be something to scoff at. Indeed, when Xietain Mayor heard the proposal from Baizemen, her heartbeat sped up. She fixed her eyes on him and asked in a serious voice, "Are you being serious?" Baizemen secretly gritted his teeth, but his outward expression did not waver as he nodded, "Of course, I mean what I say." You will help me to remove all the obstacles from all the perispheric districts and sub-districts of China, and in return I will give you resources so that you can feed your people and foster an even larger and more powerful army. Additionally, during the course of all of this you will be able to see what I and my army of soul evolvers are capable of doing. We can talk later regarding whether or not you becoming the future queen of the East Sea is possible. We have a deal then. Xietain Mei didn't even pause to think about it and nodded hurriedly as if she was afraid that Bai Zemin would decide to back out. What Xietain Mei needed the most was time to grow. She not only needed to grow her own strength in order to be respected more or for her word to carry more weight, but she also needed to raise the strength of her current troops and recruit or build up a larger and more powerful army. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Xietain Mei, and even though she did not understand the sea situation she could not help but pointed out, Xietain Mei, remember that for there to be peace, war will always be inevitable. For many to live in peace, many more need to die. Mankind's history was proof that blood washings were the only ones that truly had the ability to clean up problems, and even then it was only a partial cleansing, not a complete and total one. However, it was true that without fighting and leaving everything as it was, or naively thinking that the future would be brighter just because, nothing would really change. Xietain Mei looked at Shangguan Bingshui for a moment before sighing and shaking her head. I somehow understand what you mean, Shangguan Bingshui. That's why I need to become stronger, and also for that reason I try to recruit and raise my own army. While the history of the marine race was not as varied as Makind history, since intelligent beings were extremely rare and scarce before the arrival of the soul record on Earth, Xietain Mei had seen with her own eyes bloody battles for the control of a few nautical miles. Therefore, she understood well that to be heard she needed to have sufficient power. Those in power only listened to the strong, while the weak would be ignored if they were lucky or killed if they were too much of a nuisance. That was how the real world worked, regardless of whether it was on the surface or in the deep seas. Since that's the case, I'll leave Xiao Xiao with you. Xietain Mei glanced at Bai Zemin before lowering her head to face the little pink dolphin, who suddenly began to stir in her arms as if she was fidgeting about something. The mermaid princess raised an eyebrow as she said in a growling voice, "Child, do you really like that human that much? Before you didn't even want to detach from me, and when I told you that you were going to accompany a human you seemed so reluctant, but look at you now, just abandoning me just like that. Pooh." Xiao Xiao let out a soft, low sound as she lowered her little head, since she didn't dare to look at the mermaid princess as if she had done something wrong. Even her little pink eyes were filled with tears that threatened to fall at any moment, as if she really felt bad about it. The corner of the mouth of Xietain Mei twitched a couple of times, but before she could say anything the voice of Bai Zemin came to where she was at. "Hey, mermaid princess. Stop bullying my dolphin partner and hand her over to me at once." "Your dolphin partner?" Xietain Mei looked at him and said a bit dumbfounded, "Xiao Xiao is my subordinate. It was me who found her, raised her, and took care of her." "How can you be so shameless?" Bai Zemin raised a hand with his index finger extended towards the sky and shook it from side to side constantly, as he did with his head, while saying as if it was obvious, "Parents raise, but eventually the children leave the nest to build their lives. Besides, of course, I'm shameless. I am a human after all. Hey, don't put me together with you. Besides, apologize to all honest humans." Shangguan Bingshui gritted her teeth beside him and looked at him as if she wanted to bite him. "Humph." Xietain Mei snorted and gave Xiao Xiao one last look as she said with a hint of resentment, Go to him at once then." Xiao Xiao raised her head to look at the mermaid princess, and hesitation flashed in her eyes. Xietain Mei looked at Xiao Xiao again and said this time in a softer voice, "It's okay, Xiao Xiao. You really need to go, since you are the only means of communication we can use to coordinate the attacks." The hesitation in the eyes of Xiao Xiao dropped drastically, but still did not disappear, as she still felt a little guilty. However, when the little pink dolphin turned her face slightly to the side and looked to the bridge only to see Xietain extending both arms upwards as if waiting for her. That hint of hesitation finally vanished without a trace. Like a little bird excited to return to its nest after a long day's work, Xiao Xiao jumped out of the arms of the mermaid princess, and her pink body shined under the sun's glare, making a beautiful arc and landing perfectly in Xietan's embrace. The eyes of the little animal immediately lit up powerfully, and she began rubbing her head again and again against Xietan's armor as if she wanted to dig a hole and crawl in there so she could feel the warmth of his body more plainly. The mermaid princess's right eye contracted as she said in a flat voice, "Really? What's going on here?" "The same thing I wonder. The same thing I wonder." Shangguan Bing Shui couldn't help but nod in agreement. Xietain chuckled and caressed the dolphin's small body in his embrace as he said with satisfaction, "Welcome back, Pooh." The fleet of vehicles began to move again, but the shocks were not yet over. As the buses and other vehicles moved across the bridge, most of them had their outer vision completely covered as the glass had been removed and replaced by steel plates covered with beast skins capable of withstanding the claws of a level 20 creature without problems. Only the driver and those closest to the front were able to see what was happening in the outside world, but they were too stupefied to do more than watch with their eyes wide open. On the other hand, the soldiers who had almost total sight and the stronger soul evolvers walking around the fleet looked at their surroundings with eyes brimming with surprise. The shock was so great that none of them dared to say a single word, so the only sound that could be heard was the sound of engines and constant footsteps advancing southward. Several thousand sea beasts surrounded the bridge and followed the fleet closely. Under the orders of the 7th Princess of the Eastern Sea, any sea creature that did not belong to her side and came too close to the bridge after detecting the enormous amount of soul power was slaughtered and devoured before it could even plan an attack. The most spectacular sights were naturally the 3 giant beasts that while walking or moving raised huge waves, or splashed water everywhere. Even though they were more than 1,000 meters away from the bridge, all the soul evolvers and soldiers felt fear in their hearts at the sight of those 3 creatures that seemed to be capable of ending the world. Size really does matter after all. Nangongyi said with a loud voice as he trotted in the front to keep up with everyone. Zhongde gave him a sidelong glance and remarked, "Too bad for you then." Ha ha ha. Many laughed out loud, not only because the silent Zhongde had just made a joke, but also to release some of the pressure they felt on their bodies when the aura of more than one second-order creature and several first-order creatures advanced next to them from such a close distance. With the skills of Xian Meier, the bridge that was about to collapse managed to withstand the weight of the vehicles without any problems. Therefore, about 2 hours later, and just as the sun was beginning to set along with the drop in temperatures, they had all made it across to the other side. "We're finally here. It seems like it's been forever since I visited Chongping district, even though it was only a little over 2 months. A lot of things happened after all." The soul evolvers began chatting among themselves while looking around the surroundings at the same time as they collaborated with the armed army to create a safe perimeter, because although the zombies nearby had been slaughtered and eaten by the sea creatures that jumped onto land occasionally, in this world nothing was safe, and the training they received daily was definitely showing an effect on everyone's orderly behavior. Even those who were previously nothing more than farmers or white-collar businessmen were beginning to behave more like adept soldiers. Xietain took several steps forward and raised his head to the sky. He couldn't help but close his eyes and take a deep breath of the fresh sea-scented air. Although the air felt the same outside, to him it was completely different from the air he breathed on the other side of the bridge. Because that huge sea behind him was what kept him away from his loved ones for so long because of the zombies. Finally. I'm finally here. Chongping district. He clenched his fists so tightly that bursts of air attracted the attention of those closest to him. But no one interrupted him. Xietan's back, despite looking as powerful and imposing as ever, also looked a bit lonely when viewed from afar. Those who knew him best naturally understood his reasons and motives, so they gave him time alone. But he was not the only one who felt this way. There were many more who felt the same way, and some even began to cry silently at the thought of their families. At the same time, the gratitude and veneration they felt toward Xietain and his leadership only shot skyward. It was thanks to that young man standing in the distance that most of them had made it this far. It was also thanks to the miracles he created with his own hands that those who had not yet managed to reach the places where their loved ones could live now had a chance before them. From his monstrous strength to his ability to strike up a close relationship with the marine race. From his cruelty but at the same time righteousness that constantly created safer places for everyone. Xietain might not be the best leader in the world, but he was the leader they got and most of them didn't complain about it at all. Xietain, I am leaving here since my part is done. The voice of Xietain sounded from the sea, but Xietain did not turn around as he was too busy calming himself. Remember to communicate with me through Xiao Xiao when you decide to start. Okay. Good luck, he said aloud. Xietain did not delay and with a shrill cry took all her troops with her, disappearing into the deep sea leaving nothing but large ripples as proof of her presence, ripples which disappeared not long after. Shangguan Bing Shui walked towards Xietain with the intention of asking him what they would do next, but she seemed to sense something so she hurriedly stopped and looked at the ground beneath her feet with a frown. Her face changed slightly as she watched the small rocks begin to bounce, each time shaking more and more. Rumble. Suddenly, the ground began to rumble. It was such a gentle rumble that it could easily be ignored. However, the soul evolvers noticed the shaking as it quickly began to get stronger and stronger. Just as Xietain looked around in search of a large-sized beast, Lilith's urgent voice rang in his head. Xietain, your world is about to expand in size. Get away from the sea quickly or you might be swallowed. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 584 Earth Evolving, Annihilating Armies with a Single Slash. Chapter 584 Earth Evolving, Annihilating Armies with a Single Slash. Xietain did not stop to think about Lilith's words even for an instant, he had no time for it. Instead, what he wisely did was to let his body move before his mind sent the command. All of you. Move to the outside of the nearest town in a southerly direction. Now. Xietain turned around and roared at the top of his lungs. His voice was like a sonic boom, but instead of leaving everyone stunned it was like a snap that hit them in the back of the head to wake them up from the dreamlike state they were in. Seeing how the always calm Xietain suddenly became anxious, everyone's expressions changed for the worse and they didn't even ask when they got down to business. In cases like this where the situation was urgent, there was no time for order. The drivers started the engines of the vehicles and pushed the pedal to the end, raising curtains of smoke and rushing off into the distance in an instant. Some vehicles crashed into each other, but fortunately, they were all modified so there were not too many problems except for a few survivors who hit their heads inside the vehicles due to the fierce impact. However, the drivers seemed to understand each other as they did not even hesitate to continue driving south once they regained control of their vehicles. The ground rumbling became more and more ferocious as if an army of mythological beasts were approaching the meeting point at full speed. Fortunately, what Xietain feared the most did not happen, since if cracks had opened up in the earth, considering the world was about to expand, they would surely be cracks of colossal size, and if a vehicle fell in there it would be the end. Bing Shui. Xietain turned around to look for Shangguan Bing Shui, but when he looked at her, he was so surprised that his eyes widened. This was because just moments ago she was only a few steps away from where Xietain was, but now Shangguan Bing Shui was more than 50 meters away even though he could tell that she hadn't even moved from her spot. Shangguan Bing Shui was also incredibly shocked and was speechless. Xietain noticed how her eyes were trembling slightly as proof of shock and fear at what was happening, as well as seeing Xietain showing such a frightened attitude. Xietain gritted his teeth at the sight of her dazed and shouted again, this time louder than before, Bing Shui. The second shout finally snapped her out of her daze and clarity returned to her eyes. She looked at Xietain and oddly enough, just by looking into his eyes she knew what he needed her to do. Leave it to me. She shouted towards him before charging in a southerly direction at lightning speed and disappearing in an instant. Xietain was relieved that he didn't need to waste time and instead pulled out his military radio. He pressed a button and roared over the intercom, "To all units, pay attention. All head for Xietain town, which is in a southeasterly direction. Do not split up and take care to keep the normal vehicles within protective range, but do not deviate if one of them gets separated. Everyone is allowed to open fire at will." After shouting several orders over the intercom, orders which the different leaders in charge of the different teams began to take charge of, Xietain looked at the few who were still there and ordered in a deep voice, "All of you head south as well, straight to Xietain town. Wu Yun, you stay with me." They all nodded, and after looking at each other for a moment they activated their lightning movement skills and turned into several flashes of blue light that disappeared in a few seconds from Xietan's sight. However, it was clear that this time it was not as easy as it should have been, since they were all fighting against the enlargement of the world, and therefore they had to run a lot more and were no longer like ghosts that closed great distances in a short time. Wu Yijun approached Xietain, and even though she was also nervous, when she was close enough to him she actually calmed down enough for her clouded mind to clear. "Is the earth evolving again?" Wu Yijun asked as she looked into his eyes. Xietain frowned slightly but shook his head gently and pointed out, "No. Well, it's probably starting to evolve, but it won't be completed yet. Do you remember what happened a little over a week ago? When the sky went completely dark and then the mana in the world became denser than normal, affecting everyone?" Seeing Wu Yijun nod, Xietain pointed towards the sky and said in a deep voice, "Try to sense the surrounding mana now." Wu Yijun nodded again and with blind trust in him closed her eyes to focus entirely on the mana of the world around her. Doing this in an unknown place full of dangers and when such great changes were occurring was no different from asking to be killed, but Wu Yijun had absolute confidence that the man beside her would protect her regardless of the danger. Moreover, Wu Yijun herself was not weak at all. Bang! Xietain looked in a northerly direction and his eyes widened slightly as he saw how the sea that was so close a matter of minutes ago had now moved so far away. Of course, it wasn't that the sea had moved away but that the land had expanded. However, the dangers Lilith had warned him about finally showed themselves. Giant waves of between about 300 meters and 900 meters in height began to crash against each other, generating even higher waves that uncontrollably advanced towards the mainland as a consequence of the fierce trembling of the world. But the most terrifying thing apart from the colossal size of the waves whose power was more than enough to bring down the strongest buildings in the world were the exorbitant amounts of sea creatures that were being swept onto land as a result. Xietain stepped forward just in time to see the bridge with over 50 years of history collapse in its entirety as a result of the expansion, and after being hit by so many waves at the same time, he could not help but rejoice in his heart. Had they arrived a day later, no, an hour later, and the consequences would have been disastrous. All the efforts that Xietain had put in over the past few months to reach the south would have been completely wasted. A thread of bright blood shot out from Xietan's pants. The blood thread was so bright that it seemed to be a thread of light instead, and under his control that bloody thread wrapped around the huge hilt of his weapon, unsheathing it and thrusting it forcefully into the ground in front of him. Xietain extended his right hand forward and closed his fist tightly over the hilt of his greatsword. Then, with a strong upward pull, he pulled the weapon out of the ground before bringing it behind his body. There was a reason why Xietain had not yet left, and it was precisely this. At least 10,000 sea creatures came to the surface, and about 500 of them could only ride there as they had no ability to move on land. However, the rest began to charge forward when they noticed the presence of the two humans whose soul power was so tempting to them. According to Xietan's rough estimate, he could detect around 30 first-order existences, while the rest were all unclassified creatures. There were no second-order sea beasts present. Even so, the number of enemies was increasing with every wave that came closer and closer to the mainland, so at this rate everything within several kilometers of the sea would probably be swallowed up by the waters. Xietain leaned his body forward, bending his knees, with his right foot in front and his left foot behind. He brought his left hand back, now clinging with both hands to the hilt of his crimson thunder dragon's last words. The weird shrieks and roars of the sea creatures were really high-pitched and extremely unpleasant to the ear. Besides, their terrifying appearances didn't help either, as some of them were disgusting enough to resemble not an animal from the past but a monster out of some low-budget horror movie. Xietain took a deep breath and held all the air inside his lungs as he swung his weapon forward with all his might. The muscles of his arms under the leather armor swelled up, showing the power they concealed, and in an instant the 6-ton greatsword completed a full swing. Boom! A huge air cannon as big as a building formed in front of Xietain as a result of the pressure and speed with which he had swung his weapon. The huge air cannon shot forward like a thunderbolt and in an instant hit the ground 1,500 meters away. Boom! A fierce earthquake shook the ground even harder, and the giant air cannon, that seemed to be a world of its own, exploded as it impacted in the midst of the horde of sea creatures. Those beasts that were within 2,000 meters of the center of the explosion automatically turned into a mist of blood, with white bone fragments flying everywhere. On the other hand, the more lucky ones were cut into thousands of small pieces of minced meat as the resulting wind blades after the explosion of the giant wind cannon whipped their bodies over and over again. By the time the disaster settled down, a huge crater over 700 meters in diameter appeared where once there was soft earth, and nearby trees were blown to pieces. But nothing was over, because although Xietain had managed to eliminate more than 10,000 enemies with a single attack, there were more charging from a distance. Only a few seconds had passed since Wu Yijun closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she exclaimed in surprise. The world's mana became much thinner now. She turned and saw Xietain standing with his greatsword resting on his shoulder as he clenched the hilt with his right hand. Then, she saw him extend his left hand forward and noticed how the blood mist in the distance immediately began to move under his will. Right. The world is using the excess of mana to evolve, Xietain stated at the same time as roars of terror and pain echoed along with explosions coming from the sea, as a result of the impact of the waves capable of bringing Armageddon to any part of the world. As Wu Yijun watched in awe as the bodies of the sea beasts were sucked dry and the blood from their bodies was extracted by the blood mist that had seeped into their pores, Xietain continued indifferently. There will surely be some events like the one that happened a week ago. The world will absorb that mana and use it to evolve. I don't know how long it will take, but it surely won't be long before Earth officially enters its second stage. Roar, roar, roar. Suddenly, from the surrounding woods, several roars were heard and the ground began to rumble even harder, except that this time small cracks began to appear as proof that the addition of strength to the power of the earthquake was not due to evolution. Wu Yijun quickly looked to her right only to see thousands of mutant beasts and evolved plants running amok. Some were fighting each other, while others were just trying to move away as they were scared and didn't know what was happening. I'll take care of these, she said loudly and promptly put her back next to Xietan's back. I'll entrust it to you. Xietain nodded and focused on the sea creatures. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 585. Wu Yijun and Xietain fighting shoulder to shoulder. Chapter 585. Wu Yijun and Xietain fighting shoulder to shoulder. With the constant rumbling that not only shook the earth but also echoed loudly in the atmosphere to the point where the skies began to tremble, the number of beasts that left the depths of the forests they inhabited was not small. While most of them were unclassified creatures whose levels ranged from 12 to 25 maximum, the number of creatures that had already set foot in the First Order was not small at all. Not to mention the fact that there were all sorts of beasts with different varieties of attacks. There were also at least 2,000 or 3,000 mutant plants that crawled on the ground or jumped while cutting through the wind and smashing enemies blocking the way. Wu Yijun was strong. There was no doubt that as a First Order level 37 soul evolver, her power was among the top in the entire Transcendent faction. However, facing no less than a few hundred first-order existences was not something that was within her capability. At the end of the day, she was not a monster at Shangguan Bingshue's level, let alone Bai Zemin's level. However, Wu Yijun was a really smart woman. She knew that if Bai Zemin had asked her to stay by his side, even though with his strength he might be able to slaughter all enemies, it was not because he needed her support to fight to the death. What he needed from her right now was another characteristic of her skills that, except for Shangguan Bingshue's ice-creating ability, no one in the entire faction could surpass or match. Boom! Another terrifying explosion shook the earth, and Wu Yijun had to grit her teeth to stay steady on her feet. She looked over her shoulder only to see that Bai Zemin was repositioning his sword on his shoulder with an indifferent look, in front of him, over 1,000 meters away. The blood mist became thicker, and the sea creatures that were previously nearby had disappeared without a trace. Wu Yijun's eyes sparkled with admiration, and she subconsciously clenched both fists tightly. She really adored Bai Zemin. It was his strength that won her over in the beginning, and the reason why she was interested in him, and thus, part of why she would eventually fall in love after getting to know his personality and principles. Although the current Wu Yijun did not care about Bai Zemin's power or status as the highest leader of the entire transcendent faction, since she loved him for who he was at his core and not for something as simple as power, she could not deny that seeing the man she wanted to spend her whole life with overwhelm enemies so calmly caused her heartbeat to increase even in the middle of the battlefield. After all, it was in every woman's genetics to seek out a man worthy of them. The more outstanding the woman, the more outstanding the man must be. Although it was to a lesser degree and with more limits, human females were in a sense equal to the females of any herd, and males were no different from the males of the herd. The lioness would only be willing to mate with the one who showed to be stronger and with better genes to give birth to a more powerful next generation. Wu Yijun's eyes flashed with resolution. I cannot let him feel disappointed of me. I have to show him that other than being Shui, I can also support him on the battlefield. Since he was trusting her and was giving her this rare opportunity to fight by his side, then the least Wu Yijun could do was to make the most of every second and prove her worth. Wu Yijun pulled out 2 handfuls of small seeds that had a peculiar bright red color from inside the leather bag, tied to her waist, and threw them with all her might forward and to her sides. The red seeds flew over 1,000 meters with the help of the strong winds blowing south and separated in the air, before falling to the ground in a disorderly manner, scattering and covering a 180-degree area in front and to the sides of Wu Yijun. However, even though the mutant beasts and plants passed that range, Wu Yijun did not activate the seeds she had just cast and instead waved her magic staff while vocalizing loudly, paralyzing spores. A small magic circle appeared in front of her, and when the wave of mana hit it, it exploded, releasing a huge emerald green cloud that shimmered under the sun's glare. The cloud was carried away by the wind and spread across the battlefield in just seconds. A first-order mutant snake reached the range of 500 meters from where Wu Yijun was standing right after taking the life of a giant white mouse that crossed its path. The reptilian eyes of the mutant snake flashed with rage as it saw the 2 humans in front of it blocking the way, so it opened its jaws wide, preparing to spit out a large ball of corrosive acid, which upon hitting the ground generated hissing sounds and punctured the earth with ease, showing just how lethal it was. However, as the attack of the mutant snake was about to be completed, the eyes of the creature suddenly froze and its mouth abruptly closed. The 300-meter-long body that was sliding across the ground at a speed comparable to that of a race car suddenly seemed to lose control and fell rolling over the ground, kicking up large clouds of dust and crushing some other, smaller-sized beasts in the process. What happened to the first-order mutant snake was like the beginning of chaos, as in an instant thousands of beasts that were charging forward fell to the ground, causing explosions and kicking up heavy clouds of dust in the process. Moreover, the number of beasts that were crushed to death was not low. The first-order beasts were only paralyzed after breathing in the magic spores released by Wu Yijun for 2 or 3 seconds at most, before getting up again to charge forward even more furiously than before or to fight each other fiercely. However, at least 20,000 unclassified creatures stayed on the ground even after several seconds. Stop. Wu Yijun had no time to rejoice or to feel proud as she immediately noticed that her skill, paralyzing spores, had no effect on the mutant plants. Her voice, however, seemed to have some effect, as when the mutant plants heard the word stop, they actually hesitated as to whether they should continue moving forward or not. This was all due to Wu Yijun's job, which not only increased her affinity with the plants, but also allowed her voice to more easily reach the consciousness of those beings. Wu Yijun took that opportunity to wave her magic staff again and called out loudly, "Water chains." Activating her skill hydrokinesis, Wu Yijun made use of the large amount of water that flew from the sea and landed on the mainland to form hundreds of huge, long chains which, with another swing of her magic staff, began to coil around the creatures of the First Order. Although the water chains began to break, they served to buy time. That was all Wu Yijun needed to do, buy time. Time enough until Xietain finished off the sea creatures that were being driven out of the sea due to the waves that formed as a result of the shaking of the world. Wu Yijun heard constant explosions behind her and did not need to turn around to know that Xietain was crushing the sea creatures and beasts that were coming out of the northern sides of the forests. The reason why this was such a troublesome task was because if they let the creatures go berserk now, then it was unlikely that the Transcendent faction would be able to find a safe place to stay later. Blood bullets. Wu Yijun heard the voice of Xietain and noticed that below her and across the ground, countless small-sized shadows appeared. Then, the wind howled sharply, and moment later small but powerful blasts began to resound one after another. Wu Yijun gritted her teeth as she saw several beasts trying to flee in the opposite direction. This was what she feared the most, since in that direction were the survivors. Fire Hydra. Wu Yijun shouted and activated the second activation of her skill Second Order Plant Empowerment, Level 3. All the bright red seeds that had fallen disorderly all over the ground suddenly released a strong crimson glow, as Wu Yijun's mana was absorbed by them, and a moment later they all blasted out. Swoosh. 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 From within the seeds, thick flexible branches similar to vines grew and spread everywhere before wrapping around the bodies of those mutant beasts and plants trying to run in a southward direction. Roar. The beasts let out roars of pain and fury as the plants writhed. When their bodies were surrounded and enveloped by the bright red vines, the fire-like energy that was hidden within them was released and began to burn their bodies extremely fast, piercing the outer skin of the weaker beasts with ease and setting the plants on fire even more easily. A first-order goat whose body was enveloped by black spines and whose silver horns were over 2 meters long let out a furious roar as one of its legs began to be burned by a vine of fire that would not let it go. Suddenly, its horns released a powerful silver radiance and the light enveloped its body for a second. Bang! The first-order goat's eyes flashed with joy as it broke free from the annoying vine, but as it was about to continue fleeing south in search of a safe place for survival, it felt that this time not only one of its legs was trapped, but 2 of its legs were trapped. The first-order goat was furious, and its horns once again released that bright silver radiance that covered its body in an instant. Although it was only for a brief second, the effect was phenomenal as the fiery vines broke out again. But to the first-order goat's horror, not only did the same 2 fire vines from before reappear, but an extra one also appeared and caught its third leg and with a strong tug threw its body to the ground. Wu Yijun gritted her teeth as she tried to use all her skills to the best of her ability. While the consumption of mana was not high, as she was only using her skills to restrain the enemies rather than to create powerful attacks capable of taking their lives. In the long run it would be too much for her to keep up this pace. Probably 1 hour would be her limit if this continued like this, but even then she had to focus at 200% or else she would let the beasts break through her defense encirclement. Fortunately, she was not alone there. Boom! Wu Yijun noticed a shadow rising above her, and as she looked up she saw Bai Zemin high in the sky. She caught a glimpse just in time as he slashed his greatsword downward in a mighty swing that shook the heavens. Boom! No matter if it was First Order or unclassified beast, no matter if it was First Order or unclassified mutant plant, they were all torn into countless pieces as the huge air cannon formed from the terrifying atmospheric pressure of the ferocious swing of an object whose weight exceeded 6,000 kilograms. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 586, Wu Yijun, Charming Little Succubus. Chapter 586, Wu Yijun, Charming Little Succubus. The pieces of broken bodies that were not crushed and disintegrated to the point of turning every fiber into a mist of blood flew uncontrollably everywhere as the shockwave that hit the ground with great power generated another shockwave which crushed everything around it. Pieces of flesh, broken limbs, bone fragments, brain matter, and internal organs flew through the skies as blood rained down on the surroundings. The iron smell coming from the blood was so thick that even with the winds blowing so hard it remained permeated in the area for a long time. With gravity manipulation activated in reverse to keep his height a little longer in the sky, Bai Zemin was pulled back to Earth with a slightly but noticeably higher force than before. Earth's gravity is increasing as well. Bai Zemin muttered under his breath as he realized that not only did the gravity of attraction increase the speed of his descent, but it had also been more challenging to jump before. Fortunately, Bai Zemin had been in Oblong World about a week ago, and considering that the world of the Azura race was a clearly more evolved world than Earth, its laws were also much higher. Therefore, the current gravity of Earth was no challenge for him. Looks like I'll have to stop all major movement for a few days until the troops get used to this new gravity. Bai Zemin whispered as his feet returned to solid ground, creating a 50-meter crater with him as the center. The weight of Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words wasn't there just for show after all. Observing the surroundings, Bai Zemin realized that practically all the creatures were focused on him and Wu Yijun. As for those that tried to flee in another direction, they were immediately caught by the bright red vines that continued to grow larger and larger each time one was destroyed. At this point it seemed as if a red forest had been born out of nowhere, as beyond the vines the view was almost completely blocked. That's how big and amazing the view was now, even though a few moments ago they were nothing more than small harmless seeds. Wu Yijun, you're doing a great job. Bai Zemin looked back and praised her from the heart as he watched her eyes move all over the battlefield, activating skill after skill and accurately and intelligently preventing the creatures from breaking away. She was single-handedly holding off at least a few tens of thousands of beasts, even if it was only temporary, and thanks to the fire energy vines. The fact that a First Order existence could contain such a large army, among which there were more than a few existences within the same order of power, was undoubtedly praiseworthy anywhere in the universe. Although Wu Yijun felt extremely delighted and her heart was jumping like crazy with happiness, she did not dare to lose her focus, so she did not even have time to look at Bai Zemin to show him the beautiful smile that adorned her face at this moment as a result of his words. Now that she had managed to show her worth, the last thing she wanted was to fail near the end. One single slip-up and all the perfect balance Wu Yijun had managed to forge with her skills and ingenuity would be destroyed. This was something she could not afford no matter what. A faint smile grew at the corner of the mouth of Bai Zemin, and he couldn't help but nod at the sight of her so focused. Even though her hair was a mess and stuck to her face due to the sweat covering her body, in his eyes, this was possibly the second time Wu Yijun looked so beautiful and charming, with the first being that time during the battle against the spider army. In the eyes of Bai Zemin, a strong and independent woman was way more valuable than a beauty. In this world, beauty could be achieved by anyone, and even a woman with a disfigured face could achieve perfection by evolving, but a woman with the courage to face such a large army on her own and able to adapt to pressing situations like this was praiseworthy and a qualified partner. Sis Yijun is a good woman, don't you think? Lilith's voice sounded in Baizemin's head and his expression froze for a second before he realized that she didn't sound upset. Baizemin didn't answer right away and instead stomped the ground with all his might, lunging forward like a torpedo and closing the distance between him and the beasts. The ground cracked and pulverized rocks flew everywhere. The mutant beasts and plants didn't even have time to comprehend the situation under the agility of a monster like him. Baizemin raised his greatsword high above his head as a thunderous roar came from his mouth. War cry. Roar. A roar that resembled that of an unknown beast came out of his wide-open mouth and the sound wave hit all the living creatures in front of him. All of them, regardless of whether it was a mutant plant or first-order evolver beast, fell to the ground with their eyes rolling and foam coming out of their mouths. Die! Baizemin roared as he swung his greatsword ferociously downwards at the same time as a bright crimson flame began to dance on the weapon. Crimson flame, boom, rumble. The earth shook and the heavens rumbled. The earth shattered and cracks stretched as far as the eye could not see. The heavens seemed to weep as the few clouds in the near-night sky dispersed as they were hit by the shockwave, spread in all directions. Wu Yijun was forced to put both arms in front of her in the form of a cross to cover her face, as even though the shockwave did not extend to the back, the surroundings were covered by dirt. In fact, she was unable to stand her ground and fell to the ground, sitting on her backside due to the fierce earthquake that was incomparable to the ones before. The dust cloud that rose into the sky was approximately 10 kilometers in diameter, so it was extremely challenging to see what was happening in the core. However, except for the rumbling of the surroundings, Wu Yijun could no longer hear roars of beasts or signs of battle. Standing on an earthen stage that measured approximately 10 meters in diameter, Baizemin slowly placed his weapon on top of his shoulder and with narrowed eyes scanned the surroundings as the critical hit messages flashed in his retina constantly. Other than dirt and blood, there was nothing else there. In fact, Baizemin realized that he was standing on the surface of what appeared to be a giant crater at the moment, and only a conservative estimate told him that the crater should be at least about 1,000 meters deep. With the sound of rumbling still faintly persisting, Baizemin finally answered the question that Lilith asked before. Indeed, she is a splendid woman. Unfortunately, where heart rules, brains don't, or otherwise she would definitely be my first choice in choosing a partner to spend the rest of my life with. Oh? You're quite sincere, aren't you? Lilith didn't seem angry, even though not long ago they both practically laid bare their feelings for each other. But this was also normal, considering she wasn't a naive young girl. Lilith was a woman who had seen and heard too much to feel more than a little jealousy over mere words. I think honesty is necessary when it comes to feelings. Baizemin shrugged. Wu Yijun had been the first woman who had truly loved him and shown it without fear. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for Baizemin not to feel that she had at least an important place in his heart. In fact, she was the only woman who had openly told him how much she loved him so far, if he put aside his mother and younger sister. Lilith, seeing how the corner of Baizemin's mouth was constantly twitching, couldn't help but laugh and point out, "You're remembering dark things about your past, aren't you? Shut up. Ha ha ha, humph." Baizemin snorted and casually slammed his fist forward. Boom. A giant bubble of air and pressure burst as a result, and the entire dirt quickly began to shake off. However, it wasn't enough with just one punch, so he had to strike more than 10 times to remove all the dirt from the surrounding area and disperse it enough to see everything with clarity. At some point, the world had stopped trembling and the earth had stopped expanding. In addition, perhaps frightened by the terrifying explosions from moments before, the mutant beasts and plants stopped coming out of the forests, while the sea creatures no longer came up onto solid ground once the giant waves had completely subsided. Looks like the expansion is over. The voice of Wu Yijun sounded from behind Baizem, and as he turned around he realized that her body was completely drenched in water. Considering that she was wearing a magic robe, every part of the robe hugged her wet body tightly and highlighted to the point of the highest seduction her beautiful curves. The eyes of Bai Zemin warmed for a second before he looked away and asked in an attempt for her not to notice the way he had looked at her. What happened to your clothes? Wu Yijuan's eyes sparkled with a hint of joy, but she didn't say anything about it to prevent him from feeling uncomfortable. After all, knowing that her charm was not indifferent to Bai Zemin was more than enough for her, to be able to go to bed with a big smile on her face. Oh. About this. She blushed and began to explain. Bai Zemin felt a little embarrassed when she told him that her body had been covered by dirt and due to sweat, had turned into mud. Therefore, Wu Yijuan had no choice but to use hydrokinesis to wash her body, but still, she couldn't wait to get to a safe place and take a shower. Sorry about that, he said after coughing, while utilizing the overwhelming physical attack power and formidable weight that Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words bestowed upon Bai Zemin whenever he wielded it was the fastest way to wipe out large numbers of enemies. It was definitely far from the most optimal way. After all, the power of the greatsword was 100% destructive power that Bai Zemin had no way of controlling. While he could have used blood bullets or any other blood weapon by making use of blood manipulation, it would take more time and consume mana that he did not need to consume. Why put so much stupid effort into it when a swing of his weapon was enough to end all the pressing problems? If the situation wasn't so pressing, he might have been able to do it, but since the situation was urgent, there was no time to waste. Don't worry. It's nothing. Wu Yijuan smiled sweetly toward him and her eyebrows curved into a crescent shape. In her heart, she thought, if I can make you look at me like this, I'm willing to go through this 1,000 times. The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth twitched a couple of times at the sight of the innocent smile on her baby face. That innocent and pure smile, coupled with that seductive devil-like body, really was any man's undoing. He had to admit that if Shangguan Bing Shui was like an immortal fairy because of her beauty that simply transcended all senses, then Wu Yijuan really was like a little succubus, even though she herself was not aware of this fact. Bai Zemin naturally did not know what she was thinking, but he simply shook his head and looked off into the distance. Help me to get the soul stones. We need to catch up with the rest as soon as possible. Chongping district was also a suburb-like district located in the north of China, so the forests were dense in the area. The beasts that Bai Zemin together with Wu Yijuan had just killed were only part of the forests closer to Yanqing district, but these forests were only one of many, so it was practically a given that his faction would be fighting more mutant creatures right now. Besides, with the earth growing in size, Bai Zemin had yet to understand how far away was the point he had ordered his troops to go. Previously, a simple vehicle ride of about 30 minutes at 60 km per hour was more than enough to get to the right place. However, considering that now Bai Zemin could not even see the sea, it was a good idea to question how much the continents and the seas had actually grown. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse, Chapter 587 Earth's Expansion, at least triple its previous dimensions. Chapter 587 Earth's Expansion, at least triple its previous dimensions. Bai Zemin and Wu Yijuan began to run on the road. A road which had now been almost completely destroyed as the world grew up. In fact, it was no longer correct to call it a road at all, and at this point the pavement was no different than several pieces of concrete scattered haphazardly all over the place. Even so, it was good enough that thanks to it the two of them managed to find their way roughly to Xietain town. However, to Bai Zemin and Wu Yijuan's complete disbelief and shock, even after the two of them had been running at over 100 km per hour for 30 minutes, they still didn't even get close enough to see Xietain town. It looks like planet Earth grew at least 3 times compared to its previous one, Bai Zemin said in a slightly dark voice. Now not only did the roads have to be rebuilt, but even the maps of the past had become completely useless as far as scale was concerned. The only good thing was that so far it seemed that the world had grown equally in all directions, so every point should be located in the same space, only that the distance between 2 different points was a lot greater than before. Bai Zemin suddenly stopped his steps, so Wu Yijuan also stopped and looked back in confusion. Wu Yijuan, ride on my back, he said out of nowhere. Excuse me? Wu Yijun blinked dumbfounded as this was all too sudden. Get on my back, hurry. Bai Zemin frowned and turned around to crouch down. He pointed behind him and repeated, get on. We have no time to waste. The urgent voice was the engine that propelled Wu Yijun's steps toward him even though her mind was still blank. Although she understood that this was because her agility was too slow, she never expected that her closest contact with him to date would come in this way. However, she definitely wouldn't pass up a golden opportunity like this. Who knew when she would again have such bliss to feel the warmth of his body at close range? Therefore, she did not hesitate to obey him, and more than a command to Wu Yijun's ears was a reward. She leaned her upper body and then wrapped her arms around his neck. In fact, Wu Yijun was brave and bold enough to wrap her long legs around his waist to lock her position more firmly. Is it okay like this? Bai Zemin felt Wu Yijun's breath behind the back of his neck, and when her sweet voice reached his ears for an instant he felt as if every bone in his body weakened. But the worst of it all were those two great treasures that, despite not being able to feel their softness due to the leather armor he was wearing, Bai Zemin could definitely feel their firmness and weight pressing against the material that clung to his back tightly. It's fine like this. Bai Zemin nodded gratefully, as indeed the posture she had taken was perfect for him to move with ease. Hold on tight and don't open your mouth, Bai Zemin warned as he stood up and put strength into his right leg slightly ahead of his left leg. Boom. Wu Yijun couldn't even finish her words as everything around her became a blur. Her hair flew wildly behind her and her face turned white as a sheet when she couldn't even see her surroundings. The pressure on her body increased so much that had it not been for the fact that Bai Zemin was supporting everything by going to the front, her bones might have been crushed at this point. Only now did she understand the reason why he asked her not to open her mouth. But what crazy speed was this? Wu Yijun felt as if her heart was going to jump out of her chest in fear, but she also felt a surge of powerlessness hitting her. So this is the world he fights in? So this is the world he sees. Wu Yijun realized that this speed that for her was just exorbitant, for Bai Zemin was just normal. At the same time, she finally understood how dangerous the enemies he faced every time he got hurt were. His agility stat alone was enough to overwhelm and destroy her bones, so what about the rest of his stats? Wu Yijun could not even comprehend the level that Bai Zemin was at. While Wu Yijun's heart was staggering, Bai Zemin simply focused on running at high speed forward. Moreover, unlike her, he could see all his surroundings clearly as all his stats were high, and not only his agility was unbalanced. Bang! 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 The earth split with every stomp he made, and shockwaves of dust rose up everywhere, leaving a straight line as a trail, even though when that straight line of dust rose up he had already become a distant dot running towards the horizon. Along the way, there were numerous creatures that attacked the duo. However, Wu Yijun simply felt the wind around them howl for a brief moment before everything returned to normal. All the enemies were torn apart by Bai Zemin the first instant they decided to show up to create trouble. The only drawback was that he couldn't stop to search for soul stones or collect the useful materials, but considering the current situation, there was no time for that. Even running at over 1,000 kilometers per hour, Bai Zemin took about 5 minutes longer from when he started his run with Wu Yijun, resting her head on his back to catch a glimpse of Xietain town. However, at this point, there was no trace of Xietain town. It was a place with around 30,000 residents in the past and where nature-loving tourists often visited to stay. The nights before continuing their travels had practically disappeared to become something unrecognizable that a foreigner would most likely consider as some sort of ancient ruins. In fact, the only reason Bai Zemin was sure this was the right place was not only due to his own knowledge of the terrain but also thanks to the 2,000-meter-high ice tower that stood in the middle of nowhere. Upon arriving in the vicinity, Bai Zemin immediately noticed huge amounts of corpses spread everywhere, craters of different sizes, patches of scorched ground, frozen areas, ammunition shells scattered on the ground, and large pools where huge amounts of blood had accumulated. It was clear that a big war had taken place there, but that it had apparently been ended very soon. Moreover, judging by how the frozen areas were the predominant ones, Xietain naturally understood that if it was all over so soon it was due to Shangguan Bingshue's overwhelmingly supreme power. Leader, good thing he's all right. The leader is here. Second vice leader Wu Yijun is also fine. When Xietain stopped his steps in front of the first line of defense, composed of 2 battle tanks, 5 IFVs, a dozen gun-mounted vehicles, and about 1,000 soldiers, everyone who was tense with their weapons raised immediately relaxed and began to shout their excitement out loud. Although she felt a little reluctant, Wu Yijun had no choice but to get off Xiaomin's back when he touched her left thigh gently as if he was telling her that they had arrived at the place so she should get off. She went down and turned around to fix her hair as she didn't want the man she was trying to charm to see her disheveled. As for Xietain, he approached a soldier and ordered him to take them to the command center. The soldier was just a normal man, so when the person with the highest powerhouse in the entire faction appeared before him requesting something, he became so nervous that he almost froze. Fortunately, he quickly came out of the surprise, and with excitement bubbling in his blood, he led Xietain and Wu Yijun to the center of the destroyed city. The survivors had not yet gotten out of the vehicles. It was clear that they had been ordered to remain in their seats in an orderly fashion and without causing trouble. Moreover, Xietain saw that apart from a war tank and several dozen military vehicles surrounding the area to keep the survivors in order, the rest were nowhere to be seen. But judging from what the soldier told him, it appeared that Shangguan Bingshue had mobilized the armed troops and soul evolvers to patrol the entire 5,000 meters around in sizable groups. She had ordered to slaughter any beast, mutant plant, or any other non-human creature that appeared within the indicated boundaries. In addition, Shangguan Bingshue had also ordered all troops to immediately stop any humans that appeared in the vicinity, and the soldiers had been allowed to fire when they felt it was necessary to fire. Xietain nodded and was extremely satisfied with Shangguan Bingshue's leadership in the military aspect. He had not only sent her to follow the entire faction because of her overwhelmingly higher strength compared to any other first-order existence, but also because he trusted that Shangguan Bingshue could keep her mind cool and clear when it came to making decisions. In this kind of circumstances, where the world was going through a second crucial change, it was necessary to be cruel with the orders given, even if some innocents died. That was how things worked, and if some innocents had to die to save many more, then there was no choice but to do it no matter how cruel it was. At the end of the day, there were no gods here, and everyone was human regardless of how strong they seemed to be. Everything had limits. The so-called command center was actually nothing more than a clean clearing where several chairs and tables had been set up, as so far, Xietain had not managed to see even a single building still standing. Seeing Xietain and Wu Yijun arrive safely, everyone there was visibly relieved. As with things as they were, it was hard to tell what would happen. Even if Xietain was powerful, no one knew what might come out of the forests or the seas. After escorting Xietain there, the soldier bowed respectfully and retreated to his position again, as he didn't have the qualifications to be there. Good job keeping everyone safe. Xietain immediately praised Shangguan Bingshue in a serious voice. If it wasn't for you, the entire faction would have fragmented and countless would have died in the fauces and under the clutches of some out-of-control mutant creature. Everyone nodded in agreement at his words, and it was clear from the way they looked at Shangguan Bingshue that the Ice Princess had truly won everyone's admiration. Even the ever-cold Evangeline looked at her with more friendly eyes this time. If not for Shangguan Bingshue's crowd control skills and Chen He's ability to take out multiple enemies at the same time, as well as Kong Lan's poison, I'm afraid we really would have been in trouble this time, Nangong Lingxin said with lingering fear. Xietain noticed a white claw mark on her leather armor and a faint trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. It was clear that Nangong Lingxin had taken a heavy blow from a powerful beast that had shaken her internal organs, and if not for the armor her life might have been lost. Seeing him looking at her with a frown, Nangong Lingxin smiled slightly and shook her head. Don't worry, Wen Jian has already treated me with his skill. Except for a little pain, my condition is perfect. Nangong Lingxin was one of the soul evolvers that Bai Zemin valued the most out of his entire faction. In fact, her value hardly lost to Kong Lan's due to the fact that the skill energy barrier that Nangong Lingxin had, as well as her skill reflect, were such rare skills that only she possessed in the entire faction. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 588 City Building Plan. Chapter 588 City Building Plan. Bai Zemin noticed that Shangguan Bingshue's face was slightly pale and quickly judged that the battle, despite having gone on for less than 1 hour, had been fierce and exhausting enough that she had to consume large amounts of mana in a short time to prevent the problems from escalating. However, he didn't have much time to study her as she shook her head and calmly responded to what he had just said. What I did is no big deal. Unlike you and Xietain, who fought alone against large armies of beasts to prevent chaos from spreading around, I was being supported and assisted by a large armed army and thousands of soul evolvers. The words of Shangguan Bingshue were naturally intended to highlight that the reason why the battle had ended so quickly had also been in no small part thanks to the fact that Bai Zemin and Wu Yijun had practically single-handedly contained tens of thousands of creatures from the forests located in the north. This woke everyone up and made them realize that the reason Bai Zemin was not fighting at the front lines alongside them was because he had stayed behind to face tens of thousands of beasts to buy time, enough time for the entire faction to escape and gather in the midst of the chaos. Again, everyone's gazes on Bai Zemin were filled with admiration. However, he did not care about anyone's admiration, and the only reason he did what he did was because, apart from the fact that among those present were people he considered valuable subordinates or friends, Bai Zemin did not want all his efforts to be destroyed in an instant. Not to mention the fact that the more survivors he saved, the greater his power would be in the long run. Let's put aside who did more or who did less. Kai Jingyi interjected with a relieved smile on her face. The important point is that we managed to survive this great change despite the hardships. Right. Zhongde nodded with a serious voice and with his plate armor slightly dipped inward in the chest area. He held his mace tightly and said with a hint of pride, if this kind of situation had happened before, surely 90% of us would have died. But this time, we not only managed to survive, but we barely lost less than 100 soldiers in this war against other mutant creatures. They all looked at each other, and in the eyes of those next to them, they managed to see pride and joy in their gazes. They were no longer those people who feared at the first sign of trouble and fled with their tails between their legs. They were now brave warriors and powerful enough to take on entire armies when they joined together. Bai Zemin sighed as he looked at the people in front of him and could not help but admit that he also felt some pride in his heart. At the end of the day, he was the leader of this powerful group of soul evolvers. Each of them had gathered in this very place regardless of their past identities, thanks to him linking them together after a lot of different circumstances occurring at the same time. So, what do we do now? Wu Yijun interjected the moment and frowned as she pointed at the surroundings. Xietain town collapsed completely. There's not even a healthy building here. With the earth expanding, while there were no cracks or damage to the world itself, the structures that had been built on top of the earth were not spared. After all, the shaking of the world had been strong enough for any foundation, regardless of its quality, to collapse. They all looked at Bai Zemin waiting for his decision. At the end of the day, they all needed a place to rest and safe ground on which to set up a base. It wasn't as if they could move in vehicles forever in any case. Just as Bai Zemin was considering what to do, the voice of a person who had been silent all this time rang out. How about we build a whole new city? Bai Zemin raised his head and saw that, at some point and unnoticed by anyone, Lilith had replaced her clone and was now perfectly taking Lily's place. Everyone looked at Lilith with curious eyes since, although she should not be present, considering she was only a maid, no one really treated her as such. It was no secret that this woman whose face was nothing out of this world but whose body made men drool had a rather close relationship with Xietain. Besides, she often gave good ideas and advice, so while she seemed crazy to say something like that out of the blue, no one pointed it out. On the other hand, Shangguan Bingshui frowned and her mood immediately soured. For some reason, she really didn't feel at ease with Lilith regardless of the fact that she had been sexually assaulted by her and teased over and over again. She just didn't like her too much, and that was it. Can you explain? Xietain took a chair and sat down. Seeing Xietan's sparkling eyes, Lilith laughed in her heart. This little scoundrel may be very mature sometimes, but when it comes to crazy ideas he immediately becomes like a child who can't wait to try it out. Most were looking at her as if she was crazy. However, when Xietain heard build a city, he immediately became interested in it. Today's world is no longer the world of 2.5 months ago. Not only have the rules fallen, but the animals have become mutant beasts whose power is more than enough to demolish a building with ease. Lilith slowly pointed out something that everyone knew, but it was necessary for them to understand her point, not to mention that apart from the mutant beasts there are other races as well. Besides, wars between the human sides will happen often until a single power can unify these lands. So, wouldn't it be somewhat foolish to rely on buildings of the past which would collapse after a single blow? Everyone present immediately frowned upon hearing her words. In fact, what Lilith had just pointed out was a fact that everyone had thought of before. A level 15 unclassified soul evolver already possessed the power to knock down a house, so it was difficult to rely on buildings like before. If for some reason a soul evolver went berserk and attacked the city, most of the deaths would probably be the result of destroying large buildings, and not because of its power. Do you have something in mind? Evangeline couldn't help but ask when something suddenly flashed in her mind. Lilith smiled weakly and quietly proposed, since this is how things are, why don't we take the collapse of all the buildings like Earth helping us in the demolition process so that we can construct buildings worthy of a chaotic world like this? Mutant beast materials. Shangguan Bingshui suddenly said. Lilith clapped her hands and said happily, that's right. As expected from the second one, Shangguan Bingshui was the second in command, and when Xietain was not present she was the one in charge of everything. Therefore, when Lilith said the second, everyone assumed that she meant her as second in command. However, Shangguan Bingshui's expression sank slightly and her eyes flashed with a hint of coldness as she looked at Lilith. She naturally understood that Lilith's words were meant to mock her in another sense, and it was not as simple as everyone thought. Of course, Lilith ignored her and continued, we can use the bones of mutant beasts, mutant tree trunks, rocks, or any other natural product that possesses mana inside to forge buildings. With mana as a support, depending on the amount of mana the material possesses, the building could become strong enough to withstand the attacks of a first-order existence. That idea is great. Nangong-yi jumped out of his seat and shouted excitedly, we were so busy thinking about how to get stronger that we forgot that increasing defense is also a means of making us stronger. Lilith looked at Xietain and said with a smile, besides, it is possible to use other materials to reinforce the buildings. We could even try to find a way to use soul stones to boost that defense even more. Xietain did not delay and immediately looked at Lu Xiaoyao, who, despite having the right to be present at this kind of meeting, did not have the qualifications to intervene because her rank was not yet high enough. Lu Xiaoyao, do we have architects? Lu Xiaoyao already expected him to ask that question ever since the conversation started, so she was not too surprised. However, she shook her head and calmly answered, we have builders in large numbers, but I don't think we have bothered to invest in architects yet. Builders were not only needed to reinforce walls or erect watchtowers, but were also the perfect heavy workers as they had a high ability to adapt. They were perfect even for digging large pits that could be used as a preventive measure in case a large horde of enemies appeared. However, architects were an unnecessary resource in the first stage of the apocalypse. After all, who could be bothered with beautiful buildings or perfect dimensions when not even the next day's survival was certain? But now that the Earth was about to move into its second evolutionary stage and with probably all the buildings collapsed, Xietain felt it was time to completely change the history of mankind. The world had changed, the beings that inhabited it had changed. It was time for the buildings to change as well. Xietain fixed his eyes on Lu Xiaoyao and ordered in a deep voice, "I want you to find as many architects as possible. Not only architects, designers, tailors, interior experts. All kinds of capable people who will help in this project can leave their previous jobs if they so wish to, devote themselves to what they really know to do." Since they were going to build an entire city, Xietain would not allow that place to be a city full of hideous buildings. After all, that would be the place where they would be living. Therefore, apart from the defense of the buildings, it was also necessary to think about the decorations and arrangements designed to cover up the fact that they were living among bones and leather. Xietain did not even wait for an answer from Lu Xiaoyao and immediately looked at Wu Yijuan. "I need you to form a group with the 1st Brigade of the Blood Spear Legion and head to the nearest forests. Focus on hunting down as many mutant beasts as possible, but I also need you to cut down some trees. I know this will take some time, but don't worry about it and try to do it right." "Can you do that?" "Of course. Leave it to me." Wu Yijuan immediately nodded before looking at Kai Jingyi. "We're counting on you." Kai Jingyi smiled politely and nodded. Kai Jingyi was the leader of the 1st Brigade of the Blood Spear Legion, so she would have to collaborate with Wu Yijuan to carry out the task that Xietain requested. While the two women did not have too much contact with each other as they usually worked in different departments, the relationship between the two was not bad considering they had fought together in the past several times. With Wu Yijuan's skills and special class, fighting mutant beasts or any other creature in the forests would become many times simpler. Besides, she was really perfect for the job that Xietain pointed out, therefore, Kai Jingyi had no problem handing over the control of her unit to someone capable. As the meeting continued, as there were many things to plan as building a city was no small task, Lu Xiaoyao excused herself as she needed to prepare multiple teams to prepare dinner. Given what was happening and considering that the sun had basically already fallen, the survivors would not be allowed to leave the vehicles. Therefore, they would have to eat and sleep in there for their own safety. Xietain looked at everyone present and said in a serious voice, "This will probably be the biggest change that mankind will experience other than the appearance of soul evolvers and evolvers of other races. However, it will definitely not be the last. This is just the beginning of something much, much bigger. We will start building the first city destined for this new evolved Earth, but we will definitely build and conquer many more." Nangong Lingxin rested both elbows on the table and rested her chin on her hands. She looked at Xietain with a smile and said quietly, "In 2 months, you managed to conquer the entire Yanqing district. Chongping district is sure to fall a lot faster this time. I wonder if at that time they will also start calling you King of Chongping or something else?" Everyone looked at Xietain and chuckled. Despite what had just happened, regardless of what was going on, and no matter what will happen, none of them thought that anyone could really stand up against the young man in front of them. In the eyes of all of them, conquering the whole of China was only a matter of time. By then, each and every one of them would be etched in the history books as top heroes who participated in the countless wars meant to save mankind and who shed their blood to reunify the country under a single standard. When China was under attack by all sorts of mutant and evolved creatures, with such a bright future ahead of them, the danger was the least of their concerns. Besides, they had what everyone thought was the incarnation of the invincible god of war fighting alongside them. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 589, The Beginning of a Huge Plan. Chapter 589, The Beginning of a Huge Plan. Although the expansion of the Earth had ended, Lilith had told Xietain that there was a possibility that when a second phenomenon occurred in which the sky would darken as a result of the great charge of mana that would be injected into the Earth, the world would expand further again. In addition, the surroundings were not at all safe at the moment, and therefore Xietain ordered that the survivors were strictly forbidden to get out of the vehicles they were in. He also ordered to completely quell any attempts to cause disturbances, but to treat those who acted appropriately with respect and politeness. Although there were many survivors frightened by what was happening, fortunately, no major mishaps occurred, and since they were virtually cut off from the outside world, they did not know the exact situation of the rest. This added to the fact that there were hundreds of soldiers constantly patrolling the area where the vehicles had been parked was enough to prevent the fear from becoming a reason to cause chaos. On the other hand, there was another factor that had helped a lot to calm the waters, and it was that this time, the survivors were able to taste a delicacy that most of them had not tasted for over 2 months: fish. Fish was a common food before, as with the East Sea crossing the northern part of the country, the outer districts of Beijing enjoyed a lot of fishing. However, fish was also a food that, unlike red meat, would get rancid very quickly even if it was frozen, so it was not a type of food that could be left for several days without being eaten. So, with the mutation of the world and the creatures that inhabited it, eating fish became a luxury that even Xietain had hardly enjoyed until now. Fortunately, during the previous hunt, he had managed to recover around 200 relatively intact fish corpses. To help calm the troubled waters that were lashing the hearts of the survivors, Xietain pulled out a few low-level mutant fish and handed them over to the cooking teams to prepare soup with. Thus, although they had no smiles on their faces, the survivors were able to go to sleep without a frown and with full and warm stomachs in the middle of the cold night. The next day, the sun had not yet risen, but the now destroyed Xietain town was extremely lively. "Hey, move that over this way." Lu Xiaoyao, who was wearing comfortable but warm clothes as well as a yellow safety helmet on her head, shouted as she pointed to a group of people struggling to move a large concrete block. The group that was working hard to move the concrete block that was easily the size of an entire wall were not soul evolvers, but with more than 10 of them working together, and thanks to the fact that their stats had risen considerably as a result of good nutrition with food rich in soul power, it was possible to accomplish such a feat. Bang! The group managed to reach the place Lu Xiaoyao pointed out, and without a care in the world they roared in unison as they threw the large concrete block the size of a wall towards the place where there was a huge pile of concrete. Apart from that group, there were many others who constantly came and threw the concrete blocks belonging to the buildings that collapsed after the quake that shook the entire world during the Earth's growth, wherever Lu Xiaoyao indicated. After many had accumulated, she raised her right hand, with which she held a strange futuristic-looking gun, and pulled the trigger in the direction of the huge pile. Swoosh! Under the startled eyes of the workers, a large beam of light shot out from the muzzle of the futuristic-looking gun. The beam of light widened, and under the movement of the gun in Lu Xiaoyao's hand, it completely covered the colossal pile of rubble. By the time the beam of light disappeared, the survivors who had not yet witnessed Infinite Reduction's power gasped in disbelief and amazement. While there were all kinds of skills, seeing a huge concrete mountain turn into a pile of normal rocks had a strong impact on everyone's heart. Lu Xiaoyao nodded in satisfaction and brought the intercom she held in her left hand to the level of her lips. "You can take these away now." Then, she turned around and, seeing everyone standing there staring at her dumbfounded, Lu Xiaoyao frowned and shouted loudly, "Move. We have a lot of rubble to remove in order to build our home here." The survivors snapped out of the daydream they had fallen into and quickly got down to work for fear of losing this job. While no one would starve, eating rice with some meat every day was definitely better than eating soup forever. Not to mention that by working hard they could stabilize their lives at a level not too different from before the world changed. 1 or 2 minutes later, 2 huge trucks appeared with wagons of ice behind them under the leadership of a crane truck slightly smaller than the other 2. The crane truck driver followed the orders of those near Lu Xiaoyao and carefully lifted the huge ice platform, using the power of the crane. Then, the driver unloaded all the debris whose weight had now been reduced by 50% onto the 2 trucks. Lu Xiaoyao waved her hand and the trucks were driven away from everyone's sight, taking the debris somewhere. Under the teamwork of more than 2,000 survivors, the debris began to disappear without a trace. Fu Xiefeng, in charge of protecting the northern part of the site where the first official city of the Transcendent faction would be built, had also been put in charge of leading a team of about 1,000 survivors. 1,000 troops armed to the teeth, 40 gun-mounted vehicles, 20 modified motorcycles, 1 battle tank, 2 IFVs, 100 soul evolvers. This was the lineup that had been positioned in the north 10 kilometers away from Xietain town with the objective of stopping any advance of any kind of life either by hook or by crook. In the meantime, the 1,000 survivors were using all kinds of tools to dig large holes in the ground, because their bodies had been tremendously improved due to the good food, investment, and good vision of Baizemin. They all worked at least 3 times as effectively so that this group of 1,000 easily equaled 3,000 people digging at the same time. The earth was being removed at surprisingly fast speeds, and in a matter of minutes a straight line began to appear in the north. This straight line was a giant trench that gradually extended further and further in an easterly and westerly direction. I wonder how long it will take them to dig 100 kilometers long and 15 meters deep. Fu Xiefeng muttered before yawning in boredom with some tears on his eyes. A soul evolver standing next to him chuckled and said confidently, Vice Brigade Leader Fu, when the survivors working inside finish their stuff they will join here, so it will be faster than it looks. Well, there are also the 3 trenches being dug right now in the east, west, and south of the collapse zone as the center. Fu Xiefeng shook his head and whispered, Big Brother really has crazy ideas sometimes. Oh well, a little fry like me could never understand his big mind. Apart from the north, in the south, east, and west, there had also been stationed troops whose numbers were quite similar to the troops under Fu Xiefeng's command, with the south being specially protected with more than double the total power. Because the area being protected was so vast, it was extremely improbable that even with soul evolvers present it would be possible to prevent a lightning-fast existence from sneaking in. Therefore, about 10 soul evolvers with the active skill detector probe were positioned at different strategic points along the 4 directions so that every 120 seconds a spirit wave with a range of about 1,000 meters was launched forward with the intention of increasing security in those less protected areas and thus warning the main teams if necessary. While not a perfect measure, the area to be covered was simply too large and Baizemin lacked sufficient manpower. Therefore, this was the best temporary solution. Several kilometers distant, inside one of the forests located northeast of Xietain town, a team composed of 1,000 soul evolvers dressed in leather armor, plate armor, leather tunics, swords, bows, spears, maces, war hammers, etc., faced the 2 women standing in front of them with respectful expressions. The admiration in their eyes was simply too great and obvious to go unnoticed, especially the eyes of those female soul evolvers who saw the 2 women in front of them as examples to follow. Kai Jingyi and Wu Yijuan wore leather armor and leather magic tunic respectively. One held 2 small daggers in each hand and the other held a bone staff with a small soul stone embedded in the surface over 1 meter high. The 2 women looked at the army of 1,000 men in front of them and could not help but sigh in their hearts, as they remembered the past. A month ago, all the Transcendent faction had on hand were about 700 soul evolvers. But now, with the steady growth of applications to join the Blood Spear Legion, each brigade had 1,000 soul evolvers at their disposal. Moreover, the average level among them was level 8, while those at the highest level had already broken the first order or were about to break through the barrier that held them back. After about a minute of total silence, Kai Jingyi smiled slightly and asked calmly, Everyone, you know what you have to do, right? Yes. The shouts of 1,000 soul evolvers joined together to form a roar similar to that of a dragon about to enter combat mode as they all confirmed at their brigade leader's question. Kai Jingyi kept that same faint smile on her face and nodded as she calmly said, Go. There were no words or nods, only action that showed enough to make that silence meaningful. Swoosh. 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 Like an unstoppable wave, the 1,000 soul evolvers rushed forward at practically the same time. With melee fighters in the front, archers in the middle, and mages in the back. The typical formation that could be seen in any kind of fantasy MMORPG raid moved past Kai Jingyi and Wu Yijun, before disappearing into the shadows of the huge trees. But the silence of the forest did not last long as explosions began to come from within. Moments after each explosion, at least a dozen trees that were at least 200 meters high fell to the ground after receiving one or more powerful blows that knocked them down without any problem. The corner of Wu Yijun's mouth twitched a couple of times when she saw the giant trees flying over her head and falling 300 meters ahead with a powerful explosion and raising clouds of dust. She looked at Kai Jingyi and realized that she was stroking her dagger while humming some unknown song with the same smile as before. It was as if what was happening now was the most normal thing in the world to this small-bodied but charming young woman. Are everyone in the 1st Brigade that crazy? Wu Yijun subconsciously blurted out her doubt aloud. Kai Jingyi gave her a sidelong glance and said with an angelic smile, "What are you talking about?" "It's nothing." Wu Yijun looked away without continuing the matter. She now finally understood the reason why Kai Jingyi had earned the nickname Joker among the soul evolvers. One never knew whether the smile on her face meant kindness or death. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 590 In Search of His Family. Chapter 590 In Search of His Family. Tens of thousands of trees were cut down in a matter of an hour, and within that same time, the soul evolvers that made up the 1st Brigade of the Blood Spear Legion also removed all those trees from the forest whose size had been reduced by an insignificant notch compared to their true size. Of course, during the whole process of tree felling, not a few evolved beasts and mutant plants came out of their caves when they realized that the place where they lived was being indiscriminately attacked. As a result, a great 3-way battle among soul evolvers of 3 different races raged fiercely with blood flying everywhere and corpses littering the ground continuously. While there were a few soul evolvers who died in the process, the number was less than 20, while after fighting for a whole morning they managed to hunt down several thousand mutant beasts. The only reason this masterful feat was possible was due to 3 simple but critical factors. The first crucial factor was the purity of soul power. The soul evolvers of the Blood Spear Legion, under the strict orders of Xietain, mainly hunted higher-level enemies to level up. This led to the consequence that the stats of each soul evolver were at least slightly higher compared to those enemies of the same level. The second crucial factor was teamwork. After having received strict daily training where they were taught to cooperate perfectly with their teammates, a party composed of 2 melee fighters, 1 archer, and 1 mage or 2 archers if there was no mage free, they became capable of fighting at least 1 creature that exceeded them by 5 to 10 levels. While victory and defeat depended on the execution of the techniques learned during training, this was where the third and final crucial factor that led the soul evolvers of mankind to victory once again came in: attack and defense equipment and treasures. With the vast amount of armor and weapons that Xietain and Shangguan Bing Shui managed to obtain after facing the Azura race, the power of each soul evolver, as well as the defense, was raised 1 or 2 levels in the worst-case scenario. Moreover, with a character such as Wu Yijun present, the terror of the forests was no longer so great. With her as the main focus, the beasts and especially mutant plants fell one after another, thanks to the fact that within the forests Wu Yijun was no different from the Supreme. In this way, time flew by and soon morning turned to afternoon. Wu Yijun took it upon herself to coordinate with several cargo trucks which trailed giant ice wagons behind, and, with infinite reduction, all the felled trees were loaded, as were the corpses of evolved beasts or mutant plants. Nothing was left behind. Of course, this was a process that took many hours, and it was only at almost midnight when everyone finally returned to Xietain town to rest. There was still a lot of debris to be removed, however. It was definitely a task that could be finished within the next 24 hours if all the workers continued at the same pace. After all, Xietain town had been home to around 40,000 inhabitants, so even though in the past there had been many buildings for businesses and homes, with over 1,000 workers whose physical stats were around 3 times that of 1,000 workers in the past, as well as the support of magical treasures, the task of clearing everything would be infinitely easier and faster. Thousands of tents had been set up around the heavily enclosed grounds by the army and the war machines. Although most of these tents were only a few bones of mutant beasts along with the pelts of giant beasts, in reality they were more than enough to protect the survivors from the cold. In addition, at this point there were practically no leeches in the Transcendent faction as everyone had found some sort of job, therefore, each survivor had their own salary and therefore their own food. While most of the survivors were temporarily unemployed due to the construction process of the new city, each family had their own food reserves, which would be enough for each of those families to get through half a month without any problems. But even then, with the government supporting this whole big movement from behind, no one would go hungry no matter what. In a military tent, Xietain and Wu Yijun had just arrived from the forest located more than 100 kilometers to the northeast with Xietain town as the central point. The two women finished handing Lu Xiaoyao and the rest of the logistics team the documents detailing everything they had accomplished during the day and then headed to the military tent, located in the center of the camp. The tent was just a normal tent, but the inside had been reinforced with the pelt of a creature called Giant Brown Bear, whose level reached 29 while it was alive, therefore, the inside was very warm and the winds from outside were basically unable to penetrate beyond the pelt. In addition, the interior was divided into several parts so that several people could sleep there without any problem. This military tent was not unlike a small house by itself. Upon entering the tent, the first thing Xietain and Wu Yijun saw were the maids in charge of arranging by Zemin's comforts working to prepare dinner while the inside of the place was illuminated by a solar-powered generator, a luxury that only 3 or 4 people in the entire Transcendent faction could enjoy. Qingming noticed the arrival of the two women and quickly stopped what she was doing. She smiled politely and addressed them both, Miss Wu, Miss Kai, good job. Aunt Qin, good job to you too. Xietain smiled sweetly in response. Both she and Wu Yijun, as well as all those who could be considered close to Bai Zemin, were familiar with Qingming and also respected her a lot after learning about all the bad things she went through before she was saved. Moreover, Qingming was a woman who was really hardworking and worthy of respect apart from her own natural, mature charm which had won the admiration of several men among whom there were soul evolvers but who were eventually rejected without even receiving another glance from her. However, Wu Yijun seemed busy looking around as if she was searching for someone, so she did not even hear Qingming's words. Xietain and Qingming exchanged glances and both saw amusement sparkle in each other's eyes. How could the two women not understand who Wu Yijun was looking for and who had the capacity to make her this absent-minded, this Aunt Qin? Wu Yijun finally gave up when she didn't find the figure of the person she hadn't seen since the night before and asked quietly, "May I know where Bai Zemin is?" Xietain and Qingming again exchanged glances as if silently saying to each other, of course, this was the case. However, Qingming had no choice but to shake her head and sigh, "Miss Wu, I am sorry to inform you that the Lord is not around at the moment." "No?" Wu Yijun immediately deflated just like a balloon. Wu Yijun had been looking forward to returning to inform Bai Zemin of the progress of the mission he tasked her to do and take the opportunity to feast her eyes on his figure, so now that it became impossible to do, she naturally felt discouraged. "Aunt Qin." Xietain interrupted and asked, with a slight frown, "Could you tell us where he is right now? It must be something really important for someone responsible as Bai Zemin to be willing to leave his territory when such big changes are happening." Qingming sighed and instead of answering immediately invited the two young women to sit down. She then poured a cup of honey tea for each and slowly explained the situation. It turned out that around 5 a.m. today, about 30 minutes before everyone woke up for work, Bai Zemin woke up first and put on his armor. Because Qin Ming usually woke up around that time to prepare all the necessary things for the day, she naturally met him in the central part of the tent. Bai Zemin informed Qin Ming that he would be leaving for the rest of the day to see with his own eyes the situation Yangfang town was currently in, his birthplace and where he lived most of his life with his family. Hearing this much, Kai Jingyi and Wu Yijuan looked at each other. They both saw understanding in each other's eyes and now finally understood why Bai Zemin would disappear at such a crucial point as this. Suddenly, and as if remembering something important, Qin Ming looked at Wu Yijuan and said, "Oh, right. I almost forgot all about it. Miss Wu, the Lord left a message for you." "A message for me?" Wu Yijuan pointed to herself with surprise on her face. "That's right." Qin Ming nodded and said with a smile, "Because the Lord did not know whether he would return exactly today or tomorrow, he told me to tell you that temporarily you would be left in charge of the total power and control of our transcendent faction. He also said that you are the only person with sufficient ability among his trusted confidants necessary for such a task." She was the only one with sufficient ability within his trusted close ones? Wu Yijuan was very surprised. Did he trust her more than Shangguan Bing Shui? Wu Yijuan felt that something was not right when she thought about it, so she hurriedly asked, "This. Aunt Qin, what about Bing Shui?" Qin Ming looked a little awkward at this question, but seeing the small frown on the young lady's face in front of her, she finally sighed in her heart and spoke the truth. "It seems that Miss Shangguan understood perfectly what kind of person the Lord is and also managed to guess his plans, therefore, when he was about to leave, she stopped him and requested to go together with him." Qin Ming noticed a glint of bitterness in Wu Yijuan's eyes, so in an attempt to lift the young lady's spirits, she added, "The Lord refused several times at first, but as we all know, Miss Shangguan is a woman of strong and determined character. Moreover, her arguments seemed to be logical, so after more than 10 minutes, the Lord finally gave in and let her do whatever she wanted. Of course." Wu Yijuan raised both hands and shook her head as she sighed. Being honest with herself, Wu Yijuan had already realized that her best friend might be interested in Bai Zemin. Still, she hid it and acted as if she knew nothing. That was why she was surprised when Lily brought up this fact, as if she knew that the innocent Wu Yijuan was actually more cunning than everyone thought. But Wu Yijuan was neither angry nor jealous because her best friend was interested in the man she loved. In Wu Yijuan's eyes, Bai Zemin was the best man in the world in every aspect of the word man, so it was only natural that any woman with good eyes would be attracted in some way or another toward him. What Wu Yijuan felt was bitterness at the fact that regardless of whether it was strength, skill, bravery, talent, even beauty, she was behind her good sister in practically everything. Another thing that made her feel bitter was that Shangguan Bing Shui not only surpassed her in the aforementioned aspects but also understood Bai Zemin's train of thoughts and personality much more in depth than Wu Yijuan did. Wu Yijuan was sure that Shangguan Bing Shui was not competing against her, but Wu Yijuan was competing against Shangguan Bing Shui. She wanted to surpass her, as only then would she feel worthy to stand beside him.